Hello there. This video is going to deal with the CCEA Module 4, that's Module A21 topic, um, energy and cycles. I call it energy and cycles. Essentially, it's a topic that deals with energy flow through ecosystems and the carbon and nitrogen cycle. So it's part of the ecology or ecosystems topic in A21. So what I'm going to do here is mostly look at questions on this topic. I have in front of me a set of my notes here and a big question booklet with a lot of the most appropriate questions. In fact, nearly all of the most appropriate questions that you come across. And I'm going to work through it fairly quickly. You really only can benefit from this video if you do have access to these documents, because I'm going to constantly be referring to them. If you need these documents, then get in touch with me there. And there's my mobile number, and you can then make better use of the video. All right, I'm not going to talk through the topic as such, talk through the content as such. I'm really going to focus on the questions, and really this is a topic where you need to be doing the questions. Quite a lot of calculations involved in this topic, a lot of Massey type questions. They're relatively straightforward, but you need to be practicing, at doing those. So that's what I have in front of me here. Okay, so I'm just leafing through the content, and as I come to each part of the content, I'm going to direct you to questions that relate to that part of the content. The first thing, we're talking here about energy flow through food chains and through ecosystems, and food chains, food webs, and so on. First thing come here to in the content is this idea of pyramid relationships. And this is something you maybe come across at GCSE, pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass and pyramids of energy. And at A2 level here, you need to know a wee bit about each of these and be able to discuss them and discuss the advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to direct you first of all to questions 13 and question 16, which are two questions which relate to pyramids. And as I say, I'm not going to get into the content of this. If you want to, if you really need to understand the content of this, you need to be getting a set of my notes, which should clarify the content. I can't really go through all the content because that would take a couple of hours to go through. So I want to focus on the questions. So the first thing, as I say, is pyramid relationships in question 13 and question 16. Or questions about pyramid relationships tend to come up very sparsely, these kind of questions. You don't get many questions on this. Question 13 is a very old question, and question 16 is a wee bit more recent. Question 16, we've only got a tiny little portion about pyramids. But in question 13 there, it shows a couple of pyramids, one for Irish grassland and one for the Irish Sea. And it asks you what a pyramid of biomass is. Essentially, a pyramid of biomass is where you are measuring the amount of biological material, the mass of biological material at each trophic level. And you arrange that then as horizontal bars. It's a bit like a bar chart, except it's lying down on the side, so the bars are on their side. And we're looking here at two types of pyramid, and one is for Irish grassland and the other, as I say, is for the Irish Sea. And notice the one for the Irish Sea is what you'd refer to as an inverted pyramid. So normally you would expect your pyramids to sort of look like this, go up in a sort of pyramidal shape, like that. But this one for the Irish Sea is upside down, as it were, so there's a very small bar at the bottom, and then a bigger bar, so it's actually just got two bars on it. And the bottom bar then would be the producers, and the next bar would be the primary consumers. in that pyramid. And perhaps you do a calculation of efficiency, and quite often you do get this, the efficiency of energy transfer. So basically you need to know the amount of energy at the producer level and the amount of energy at the primary consumer level, and you work that out. For the, and I asked you here for the Irish grassland one. Now the Irish grassland one is a normal upright pyramid. It's not inverted. Now, the question that comes up quite frequently is, how can you have such a pyramid where the bar for the producers is less than the bar for the primary consumers? In other words, there would appear to be less biomass and less energy at the producer level than at the primary consumer level. And this comes down to the idea that this bar, these bars only represent the amount of biomass present at the time of measuring. So they don't represent the amount of biomass that's there, the total amount of biomass that's there. It's just the amount of biomass that's present at that particular time. And there's a term for that. The term is the standing crop. So, as in my notes here, I'm saying there would appear to be a greater mass of the primary consumers than a mass of producers to support them. This only makes sense if we understand that these masses are measured at a point in time. So when you go along at a point in time and measure the mass, you may find that you have an inverted pyramid like this. The example I give there is for you have a situation, let's say, with cows eating grass in a field. You go into that field and you measure the amount of biomass. So you'd have to get the amount of biomass of cows, the primary consumers, and the amount of biomass of grass in the field. When you discover that, you discover that the mass of the cows is greater than the mass of the grass. Especially the grass is very short, and that doesn't make sense. But it does make sense when you realize that the producer, which is the plant, the grass, you're only measuring the grass that's there that particular day, so-called standing crop. And that if you were to measure it properly, you should measure the amount of grass that was there yesterday and the day before, and so on and so forth, because all of that contributed to the biomass of cows. So in that situation, you get a very small bar for the grass in the field, because you're only measuring the amount of grass that's present at that particular time. The same applies for this is one for an ocean situation or a sea situation. It would appear that the amount of producers in the seawater is much less than the amount of primary consumers, and that applies the same. That's essentially the same idea as the grass and the cows. The amount of primary producer in this case is the amount of plant material in the form usually of microscopic plants that are present in seawater. And if you measure the amount of microscopic plants that are present in seawater, it doesn't seem to measure up to the amount of primary consumers that you have in a particular area of seawater. But then you need to realize that the microscopic plants in the water, the algae or phytoplankton they're often called, are a bit like the grass in the field. They're being used up each day and replaced on a continuous basis. So what you get when you measure at any particular measure the producer in the ocean or sea is just what's there at this particular time, so-called standing crop. And if you use that term, then you get the marks. Now, if you go to question 16, asks something similar in part B. It says the biomass of zooplankton, that's the microscopic plants in the microscopic animals in the sea, is greater than that of the plants. And you have to say, they ask you, why is that the case? And you say, oh, it's because the plants are constantly being consumed and are replacing themselves, are constantly regrowing again. In other words, you're just measuring what you measure at any particular time. It's just the so-called standing crop here. So it says here, the crop biomass has only been measured, or the standing crop biomass only has been measured. The biomass is quickly replenished on a continuous basis. So that's all I want to say about pyramids of biomass and pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass. I'll leave you to read that in the notes there, and you can understand it much better. So as I say, you're not going to get much off from this video unless you have access to the notes and to the questions, because I'm going to make constant reference to these notes and to the questions. Okay, so the next thing that comes along there, and a more useful area to look at, is energy losses and energy flow through food chains. And I'm just looking there on page 7. The number of questions on this booklet, then you can take a note of those if you want. Questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 12, and 17 are all about energy flow and energy loss in food chains. So that's a very large number of questions, and it's only in the doing of those questions that you get good at them and you understand the concepts. So typically you get asked to calculate percentage transfer between different trophic levels, as you do in question 1. And question 1b asks something interesting. It says, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase it. When a bird, so for example, whenever a chicken, for example, is eaten by a fox, the efficiency of energy transfer is typically lower than whenever, for example, a leech is eaten by a stickleback. That's quite a difficult question. They're basically saying, compare a situation where a fish is eating a little smaller thing called a leech, which will be found in the water, compared with a fox eating a chicken. Now, it's a good question. It's a decent question, and essentially they want to know why the efficiency is greater for the fish eating the leech as compared to the fox eating the chicken. And essentially, what you do is you focus on the fox eating the chicken, and you can say things like, when the fox is eating the chicken, not all the chicken gets eaten, so maybe not all the bones get eaten, not the feathers don't get eaten, the feet possibly don't get eaten, and then also once the fox has eaten the chicken, not all the parts get digested. So you're focusing on the idea that not all the chicken gets eaten, and then even if it does get all eaten, it doesn't all get digested properly. And then you would also maybe go on to say that the fox has greater losses in respiration, so the fox uses up a lot more of the energy in respiration, and possibly you could get a point then for saying the fox is warm-blooded compared to the fish. In other words, the fox is what's called an endotherm. The fox has to keep its body temperature high, and to do that, the fox then needs to use up a lot of energy in respiration. Now, so that's a typical energy transfer question. As I say, there are several questions there. See question 3, question 4, and typically they're looking for sources of energy loss in food chains. One place there, an old question asks, why are food chains rarely more than about 4 or 5 trophic levels long? And what you would say there is, as you progress along the food chain, energy is lost at each trophic level to the extent that after about 4 or 5 trophic levels, there is insufficient energy left to support another trophic level. So you're getting high losses of energy as you travel along the food chain. Other things that you get asked about there is this idea of GPP and NPP. GPP is gross primary productivity, and essentially it refers to the amount of energy that is stored in a producer, in a plant. GPP. The energy that's stored in a plant due to photosynthesis. NPP represents the amount of energy that's left after that plant material uses up a certain amount of energy in respiration. So you end up with this idea that GPP is equal to, NPP is equal to GPP less respiration, and this is an important equation. I think people generally remember the equation. So NPP is equal to GPP minus less respiration. So GPP represents the energy that will be stored in the primary producer, stored in the plants, and then NPP represents the energy that's left after the plants use up a certain amount of that energy in respiration. And you get that question coming up. Well, maybe not, you might get asked directly to explain what NPP and GPP is, but to actually calculate it. And the only way you can see how to do these calculations is to actually do the questions. So I'm looking at question 3, and there's several other questions there where you're asked to calculate the gross primary productivity. Now that takes me on there to energy loss by plants. Energy loss by plants. So this is looking at the process by which plants trap the sun's energy and store it in the plant as glucose. And the energy that's trapped in the plant and stored as glucose essentially is GPP. Gross primary productivity. And there's one main question there which looks at the ways in which this process is inefficient, or ways in which the energy that's available to plants, most of it is, as it were, squandered. Most of it is not stored in the leaf in the form of glucose. There's a lot of ways in which you get losses of energy. And question 8 shows you a diagram of a leaf there and asks you to discuss the different ways in which you get energy losses. And the diagram there is very helpful because it shows most of the major ways in which you lose energy, and the major ways there. So it's talking about the fact that first of all, most of the sun's energy that's coming to the planet is actually reflected off our atmosphere, reflected off clouds back into the atmosphere, and we're talking in the regions of 90% or more, much more, maybe something like maybe 95% of the energy is reflected back off the clouds. And then the energy that does get through the atmosphere to the ground, to plants, much of it misses the plants. So we have to exclude light energy then that misses the plant leaves and goes right past the plants and strikes the ground. Light that does, even the light that does strike the plants, then a certain amount of it's reflected off the surface of the plant. Reflected off, you could say, off the waxy cuticle. There's a good shout there, but generally you get a certain amount of energy reflected off the plant. Light energy is also used to evaporate water off the surface of leaves, so you lose some of the energy that's heat there. Of the energy then that does actually make it into the leaf, then some of the energy that's available in photosynthesis is lost too due to the inefficiency of photosynthesis. So you get lots of losses of energy, inefficiency of photosynthesis. You also then, not all the energy that strikes the leaves is the correct wavelength for photosynthesis. What I mean by that is that chlorophyll and the other pigments don't absorb all the colours, all the light energy, all the colours in the light spectrum. They don't absorb green very well, so that amount of energy, that energy is not trapped in the plant. Some of the light energy passes right through the leaves and is not, doesn't strike chlorophyll or doesn't strike chloroplast. So those are the major places where light energy is lost in the process. It asks an interesting question. It just says, how can farmers and growers maximize the amount of light energy falling on the leaves of a crop plant in a field or in another situation? And you could say things like plant the plants close enough together so that they trap all the light that is going to strike the field. Don't plant them too close together so that they overlap their leaves. And also choose plant varieties that have leaves that are held, as it were, perpendicular to the sunlight, so that they trap the most energy. Anyway, that's a wee question, that's some question 8 there. Question 9 is a big essay question based on energy losses at all the different trophic levels. It's asking about energy losses in in primary consumers, secondary consumers, energy losses in primary producers, that's in the leaves and the plants, energy losses through consumers, and also a wee bit about farming and energy losses. So that's quite a good essay, and there's about somewhere in the region of 30 bullet points there in terms of answers for that question. That's actually an essay I constructed myself about 10 years ago, just to try and cover that particular topic, and there's a lot of points there. So we talked initially there about energy losses in plants. Next we want to talk about energy losses between plants and primary consumers. So in other words, animals that eat plants, so traditionally referred to as herbivores. So we're talking about farm animals like cattle and sheep and all the other animals that eat plants. It's still a very inefficient process. So whilst we were talking about overall for energy transfer from sunlight available striking the planet to plants, that's about 1% efficient. In other words, plants only absorb about 1% of the energy that's available. Here we're talking about slightly greater efficiency. We're talking in the region of 5 to 10%. So the efficiency of energy transfer between plants and animals that eat plants, herbivores, is about 5 to 10% efficient. Extremely inefficient, you would regard that. Very, very low efficiency. So only a very small proportion of the energy eaten or available to animals actually gets incorporated into the animal's body. Search of reasons here you put across for this would be things like not all of the plant material gets eaten. So for example, most animals wouldn't eat the roots of a plant, they eat the stems and leaves of the grass, not all the plants eaten. The animals won't eat all the plants available to them, they may trample some of it or spoil it with feces and not eat it. Of the plant material they do eat, then it's not all digested. And here you have to note that plant material is very difficult to digest, largely because plant material is made up of plant cells, and plant cells are surrounded by cell walls made of cellulose, and most herbivores don't have any enzyme to digest the cellulose. Cellulose is incredibly difficult to digest. They rely largely, animals eat plants often rely largely on the presence of bacteria in their guts, in their digestive systems, to produce the enzyme cellulase to break down plant material. And this is an example of a symbiotic relationship or a mutualistic relationship where each benefits from that arrangement. Of the energy then eaten by the animals, some of the food energy is lost in urine, for example in urea, and generally about half the energy eaten by a typical herbivore is used up in respiration. And here you have to make reference to the fact that typical herbivores tend to be warm-blooded like ourselves. In other words, they are what's called endotherms. In other words, they need to use a lot of energy in respiration to keep themselves warm. So that's where the big losses in energy, big uses of energy in the body of the herbivore is in respiration, simply to produce heat to keep the animal warm. Students are inclined to say the energy is needed for movement. Yes, a certain amount of energy is needed for movement, but you need to mention that most of the energy eaten by the herbivore is actually used to keep its body warm. And you see on page 11 then, in just the diagram of the cow there, and you see the different energy losses and where the energy goes to. And I'm referring you there to questions 5 and question 6, which are both looking at herbivores and looking at energy flow and energy losses. Typically calculation questions. I'm not going to dwell on them. Really, you need to have the questions in front of you and to be doing the questions and working them out. So question 5 and question 6 Let me just have a look at question 6. Question 6 is an older question, and it's asking, in terms of energy loss, explain the reasons for the high value shown for respiration for the cow. And the answer is, you'd say the cow's an endotherm. She uses an awful lot of energy for to maintain her body temperature, and she is an endotherm. And then it also says why there's such losses in feces. Feces is basically undigested food. So most of the food that the cow is eating, or most of the energy that the cow is eating, is simply passing through her body as feces. That's basically an undigested food. And they're asking, why is there such a high level of energy lost in feces? And essentially what you're going to say is the cow's food contains a lot of cellulose, plant material, which is very difficult to digest. So that's the answer to that. One method of increasing the efficiency is looking at farming and food energy loss. Ways of increasing the efficiency of your animals might be, for example, to place them in confined space. In other words, don't allow them to move around so much, or even keep them indoors. And then we'll ask you reasons why confining livestock would increase the efficiency of energy transfer. Well, you could argue that if they don't move around so much, then they don't use up so much energy. Also, confining animals in small spaces means that they tend to lose less energy to their environment. They tend to lose less heat energy because they're huddled maybe together, especially if they're indoors. Then if they're indoors, they're protected from the exposure to wind and rain, and so they lose less energy as heat to keep their bodies warm. And also possibly if they're confined, you can make their feeding more efficient. You can supply food to them at appropriate times, and you can ensure that less food is wasted. Okay, moving on from those kinds of questions about energy flow through animals, and moving on just to quickly on pages 12 and 13, there's quite a few illustrated questions. They're exemplar questions which look at these energy interchanges. Quite a bit there on farming and energy losses, so that's interesting because there's lots of places where energy can be lost in farming, and it's looking at how farming can work to try and minimize energy losses. So I'm just looking here at how animal productivity, which is basically the efficiency of farm animals. You can feed high energy food that is very highly digestible, so there's less energy lost as feces. Efficient feeding systems, so that the animals don't waste much of the food. Confine the animals in small space, as I already said, and house the animals to reduce energy losses as heat and so on. Now, moving on then to what is a very prominent part of this section, that is the cycles, the carbon and nitrogen cycle. Now, the carbon cycle gets very limited exposure in terms of exam questions. There rarely is anything about the carbon cycle. And part of the reason is that the carbon cycle is relatively straightforward. You do the carbon cycle at GCSE, and so you rarely have much difficulty with the carbon cycle. I'm maybe just going to quickly do a quick carbon cycle on the board here, just to give you, for the people who have my notes, just to give you a picture perspective of the carbon cycle. So let's see if I can do that quickly. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to have a tree here. So that's a tree. And up here we're going to have a sort of a cloud, and the cloud represents CO2 in the air, in the atmosphere. CO2 in the air. Okay. Now we're going to draw some arrows then. So essentially we're looking at the movement of the element carbon around through nature, through the from the atmosphere of the earth and through living organisms into plants, animals, and so on. We're looking at its progress. So we can start first of all and say, we can draw an arrow from carbon dioxide in the air down to the tree. This is a tree, by the way. And we're going to write on here photosynthesis, P stroke S. So photosynthesis is a process by which carbon dioxide in the air is taken into plants and stored in the plants as glucose. Now, where we're going to go from there then is to have a leaf. Let's look at it, maybe a leaf that has fallen off the tree. So this is supposed to be a leaf here. And that leaf has fallen off the tree. Okay. So we'll have a look at what happens to that leaf. Now, that leaf, one of two things could happen to it. It could get, let's say it could get eaten. So I'm going to draw something that might eat it here. This is maybe a rabbit. That's supposed to be a rabbit, not a great rabbit. There's a rabbit, and you could draw an arrow from the leaf to the rabbit, and on that arrow you could write eaten, because that's what happens. The carbon in the leaf is eaten by the rabbit. And you would say, how's the carbon? What's the carbon in the leaf? Well, remember, the leaf is made up of biological molecules. It's made up of cells, plant cells, and plant cells are made up of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and DNA. All those things are present in a leaf. Of course they are, because a leaf is made of cells, and plant cells are full of all those things. So plant cells, for example, cell wall made of cellulose, carbohydrates inside the plant cell, the form of starch, amylose and amylopectin. So there's your carbohydrates. Your lipids in the leaf. Of course, the leaf made of cells. Cell membrane of the leaf is made of phospholipids. Here we are. And of course, then there's also proteins in the leaf, because there's lots of proteins in the cell membrane of every cell. So there's proteins. So there's carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins in the leaf. And of course, there's DNA, because every leaf cell has a nucleus and contains DNA. So there's definitely carbon in the leaf. So we'd agree there's carbon in the leaf. And that carbon then, when the rabbit eats the leaf, it gets the carbon as present in the leaf. Now, I'm going to put a couple more arrows on here. The rabbit then could do respiration. Respiration, so I'm going to write on R-E-S-P-N. Maybe you can't see that. Well, respiration. And respiration, then the rabbit would use up the carbon that was taken in its food, which is the leaf. Use that in respiration and release the carbon as CO2. So respiration would cause the amount of CO2 in the air to increase, just in the same way as photosynthesis caused the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to decrease. And now, I'm going to change pens here. Plants also do respiration. So put an arrow there and write respiration. Plants also do respiration. So there's a carbon dioxide return to the atmosphere. Remember, plants and trees at night time can't do photosynthesis, but they can definitely do respiration. And respiration is releasing CO2 into the air. Now, where else can we go from this? Well, this leaf here that's fallen on the ground, it could undergo decomposition. In other words, it could decay. And essentially it would decay into the soil. Now, decay involves microbes who basically break down the leaf, who decompose it. And the microbes, essentially the microbes are feeding on the leaf. They're using the molecules in the leaf to multiply and grow, but also for their respiration. And as a result, microbes also do respiration. So the microbes are doing respiration. So I'm going to write here respiration, E-S-P, and respiration by we would say decay microbes. Decay microbes. Decay microbes. Respiration by decay microbes, that's this arm. Okay, of course the rabbit could also could also die, and then it would be decayed and you get respiration. It could be decayed, so you get respiration by decay microbes as well. And essentially, we've nearly got the carbon cycle completed now. And the only other thing is nearly chemistry. We could say that over millions of years, dead plants and dead animals undergo a process called fossilization. Fossilization. And fossilization gives rise to something called fossil fuels. So the carbon that was present in the leaf or in the rabbit is now stored over millions of years, can be stored in fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are the product of millions of years of storage of dead plants and animals as these fossil fuels. And then of course everyone knows that fossil fuels can be burned. And when you burn fossil fuels, we refer to that as combustion. And combustion then releases CO2 back into the air. So think about everything there now. So the main processes involved in the carbon cycle are photosynthesis, respiration, fossilization, decomposition. So lots of all the leaves, for example, that have fallen off a tree, if they don't get eaten, they're going to decompose. And decomposition of those leaves then is going to release CO2 because the microbes that are doing the decomposing are doing respiration. And so there's your carbon cycle. As I say, you don't get asked the carbon cycle. So very much, if you do get asked about the carbon cycle, it might well be something of the nature of asking you about global warming. Global warming might be what you would get asked about. Okay, I'm just going to sort out my pens here. You get asked about global warming. Now, so there aren't, I can't really come across a question on the carbon cycle at all. Just looking there, there's one question, question 7, and it's not really about the carbon cycle, it's more asking about global warming and so on. Now technically this is not really on the A2 course, but I included that question because it had some useful aspects to it. This would be actually covered in AS as an AS topic, so you can possibly ignore that question you want. Finally, we want to look then at the nitrogen cycle. I'm referring you then to page 21 in my notes, and I'm just looking here the number of questions on the nitrogen cycle. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. 10, 11, 14, 15 and 16 are all about the nitrogen cycle. So in any test, any year, any exam, you can almost count on there being a question about the nitrogen cycle in some form or other. Questions about the nitrogen cycle. As I say, you're unlikely to get a question about the carbon cycle at all. The carbon cycle is considered just too easy, as it were. What I mean too easy is that it's difficult to contrive, it's difficult for the examiners to make up or contrive a difficult question on it. So they tend to go for the nitrogen cycle, since they know the nitrogen cycle is much more difficult. And the nitrogen cycle, questions on the nitrogen cycle tend to be able to discriminate between students who are good and students who are very good, as it were. They tend to be the most difficult questions well, they tend to be quite difficult questions. So the nitrogen cycle, I'm actually going to attempt to do a nitrogen cycle on the board here as well and do a picture. As I say, the best thing for you to be doing is to be doing those questions 10, 11, 14, 15 and 16, and I might refer to those briefly in a moment or two. But I'm going to attempt to do a nitrogen cycle in pictorial form. In the notes there, I would have a sort of boxy type diagram of the nitrogen cycle, quite typical of what you get in exam questions where you get a series of boxes with arrows between. But I'm going to do a pictorial version of it. Hopefully that might help you. So let's see where we start here. I think we need to get that arrow a bit higher. Now I'm going to put that there represents the soil, and pop a tree up here again. So we've got so this is supposedly a tree. And now this time I'm going to get rid of our diagram, and up there at the top I'm going to pop sort of a cloud, and that's going to this time represent nitrogen gas. I'm going to say N2 gas, nitrogen gas. I'm going to say in the air. Really, I wanted to write in the atmosphere, but I'm just going to write nitrogen gas in the air. I can't squeeze in the atmosphere. Now, the other thing I want to do here is to put some roots on this tree. Now, it doesn't have to be a tree, of course. The tree just represents a plant. So you've got the roots of the plant. Let me see if we can get this right. So there's the tree with its roots. Now, the key player in this story is nitrates. So I'm going to pop nitrates onto the tree here. So nitrates, let's get nitrates down. Nitrates. Now, right, how are we going to proceed here? Now, the first thing we're going to look at is, once again, we're going to have a leaf that's fallen off the tree. I'm going to pop a leaf here. And there's our leaf. It's fallen off the tree onto the ground. And where we start here is we recognize that the leaf gets decomposed, assuming it doesn't get eaten. We'll assume here it just gets decomposed. Maybe move the leaf a wee bit over here just to give us a wee bit more space. So there's the leaf over here. And the leaf has fallen on the ground, and the leaf now is going to get the leaf is going to be decomposed. Now, what happens when the leaf is decomposed? Well, what you get is you get a product called ammonia. Ammonia produced. So decomposition produces ammonia, and it's difficult here to get all this written on, but essentially this is decomposition. Decomposition. I'd rather write decay because it's quite easier to write, but decomposition decomposition is carried out by microbes, decay microbes, you want to call them, decomposers. Basically, they are microscopic bacteria and fungi. And the product of decomposition is ammonia. Now notice these compounds all contain nitrogen. They all contain nitrogen. So nitrates is NO3 minus, you could write nitrate ions. Ammonia is NH3, so it contains nitrogen. So the product of decomposition is ammonia. Now, the next thing you need to know is in the soil there are bacteria that live in the soil. And what they can do is they can convert the ammonia into nitrates. They convert the ammonia into nitrates. And here I want to flag up nitrates as being, maybe shouldn't have done that. The nitrates are all important. So ammonia has been converted into nitrates. And this process is called nitrification. So I'm going to try and write that nitrification, I-T-R-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N. Unfortunately, all the words in the nitrogen cycle are very long. Nitrification. And nitrification is carried out by a bacteria called nitrifying bacteria. Nitrifying bacteria. So just to reiterate, the leaf was decomposed by decomposer bacteria and fungi. And that produced a product called ammonia present in the soil. And then the ammonia can be converted into nitrates by nitrifying bacteria, and the process is called nitrification. Now, as I say, the nitrates are all important because nitrates can be taken up into the roots of plants, taken up. And you remember back to GCSE, they were taken up by active uptake, and they were taken up in the roots. And the cells that you used to refer to in the roots were root hair cells. So here I'm going to write active uptake, active C-T-I-V-E. So the nitrates are taken up by active uptake into the roots of the tree. Now, the question is, what does the tree do with the nitrates? Well, at GCSE you were asked that. What does a tree need nitrates for? And the answer was nitrates. Well, if you think of it this way, nitrogen, what compounds in the tree, or what biological molecules in the tree are needing nitrogen? And I think the tree is really just food. Essentially, it contains carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and DNA. Which of those molecules need nitrogen? Carbohydrates, fats, lipids, proteins, and DNA. You might remember both proteins and DNA. So you would say that the nitrates are needed to make proteins. And you could say nucleic acids. I'm going to say proteins and DNA just. So that's what the nitrates are taken up by the tree for. So the plant cells can make their proteins and their DNA. See, the plant cells cannot make those proteins and DNA without a source of nitrogen. The plant cells have a source of glucose from photosynthesis, but glucose only contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, whereas you need nitrogen to make amino acids or proteins, and you need nitrogen to make the nitrogenous bases for the DNA. So the nitrates are taken up by active uptake into the tree. So at this point, I want to just say something about these processes. So the three processes was decomposition, nitrification, and active uptake. All three of these processes, I should have maybe just put an arrow from the tree down to the leaf just to show that the leaf has fallen off the tree there. I'm not going to write anything on that, but basically you understand the leaf has fallen off the tree. These three processes, decomposition, nitrification, and active uptake, all happen much more readily and much more quickly if oxygen is available. If there is air available with oxygen present. Don't say air available. Air suggests could mean just nitrogen, but oxygen available. So all these processes are sort of aerobic processes that happen better when oxygen is available. Why is that the case? Well, it turns out that the microbes that do the decomposition are very aerobic. If you provide more oxygen, the process of decay or decomposition happens faster, which you may have learned at GCSE level. Decomposition is faster with more oxygen, more air, because more oxygen for the microbes that carry out decomposition and multiply much more quickly. The conversion of ammonia to nitrates carried out by nitrifying bacteria. Guess what? These nitrifying bacteria are also very aerobic. So plenty of oxygen in the soil, plenty of air in the soil encourages nitrification to take place. So you get more nitrification. And thirdly, active uptake is a very aerobic process too, because active uptake is done by root hair cells, by active transport essentially. If you remember from AS, active transport required ATP. And if you have more oxygen available in the soil, the root hair cells can do more respiration and release more ATP, and so you get more active uptake. So all these three processes are encouraged by having plenty of air in the soil that provides plenty of oxygen for for all these processes. So if a farmer, all these are good processes, and farmers and growers, and we're not talking people growing trees. I suppose maybe we're thinking more of a crop here, like potatoes or barley or wheat or grass or whatever. If farmers and growers growing plants then would want to encourage decomposition, nitrification, and active uptake, and they do this best by encouraging their soil, or sorry, not encouraging the soil, by having their soil very airy and full of oxygen. So they would need to get oxygen into the soil. So a soil that's got plenty of oxygen in it is considered to be fertile soil. Fertile meaning the soil is good for plant growth. That's essential because these processes all happen better with plenty of oxygen. And the question they'll often ask is how would a farmer or grower ensure plenty of air in the soil or plenty of oxygen in the soil? You can say things like plough the soil, mix it or loosen it up, let plenty of air into it. Plough it is a good answer. And also drain the soil. Drainage means put in pipe channels in the soil to remove excess water. And if you remove excess water, you make more room in the soil, more spaces in the soil for air. So excess water, if you can drain that out of the soil, then you can get more air into your soil. So those are the two methods: plough your soil, plough or cultivate your soil to get more air into it, or drain the soil to remove excess water. Soils that have excess water are not good. Remember, we refer to those as waterlogged soils. Now, I'm going to see the significance of that, because there is another process that can happen here, and this other process is called, sorry, I've set my arrow in the wrong direction. The other process I want to look at that can happen here is a process called denitrification. Now, denitrification, another very big word, D-E-N-I-T-R-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N. Denitrification is another process that can happen in the soil. And it's brought about by another group of bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. We don't like them. We don't like denitrifying. Farmers and growers wouldn't want too many denitrifying bacteria in the soil because they get rid of the nitrates. They remove the nitrates. So the nitrates are very important. Any way of getting lots of nitrates in the soil is a good thing. Lots of nitrates is good because it makes your plants grow much more. Anything that removes nitrates, not so good. Denitrification removes the nitrates because the bacteria that are involved in denitrification, denitrifying bacteria, they will convert nitrates into N2 gas. And that N2 gas then escapes from the soil. It kind of leaks out of the soil. As it leaks out of the soil, then that's the nitrates gone. So denitrification is in terms of farmers growers, a negative process or a bad process. Now here's the thing: these bacteria that do denitrification they don't grow very well if the soil is got plenty of oxygen in it. They're actually encouraged by wet soils because they're quite anaerobic in the sense that they can grow quite well in soils that contain a lot of water and lack oxygen. So it's a no-brainer for the grower then. The good processes that create the nitrates are all made better by the presence of lots of air in the soil, and at the same time lots of air in the soil stops this bad process that removes the nitrates. And so it's a no-brainer for the grower, farmer, whatever. They want to keep the soils well aerated. Encourages these processes and discourages the denitrification. Now, so essentially, that's that process. One other thing we need to say here is that, and this comes up in many questions. I want to give a bit more room over at the edge because I'm going to put another plant in the picture, and here I'm going to put a plant, and I'm going to refer to this plant as that's the roots of the plant. Now, this is an example of what's called a legume, and examples would be peas, beans, and clover. Now, what we observe is when you plant peas, beans, and clover in a soil, you observe then shortly afterwards that the roots of the peas, beans, or clover, this is the roots. The roots develop little lumps on the roots, and these little lumps are called nodules. Root nodules. These plants are an example of what you refer to as a nitrogen fixing plant. That's nitrogen fixing plant. And the bacteria that are inside the nodules are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. How do they get inside the nodules? Well, actually, they live free in the soil normally, but once you plant this plant, these bacteria invade the roots. They take over the roots and make their home in the roots in these little nodules. And then there they do something very useful. And what they do is they take nitrogen N2 gas from the soil. So I'm going to bring an arrow down here like this, and N2 gas, and bring it up to the roots. And that's N2 gas, which is present, the nitrogen gas will be present in the soil in the air spaces. And it's available to these bacteria. And what these bacteria do is they turn the N2 gas and they make the N2 gas into nitrates. They convert N2 gas into nitrates. And this process is called nitrogen. I'm just going to use an N for the nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation. Now this is a very common question. And so these are very specific bacteria that normally live free in the soil. They can convert N2 gas into nitrates. In fact, it's more complicated than that. They convert, there's a questionnaire, get which question, I think it's maybe the last question in the booklet, and you have to say that they convert nitrogen gas into ammonia initially, and then the ammonia can be used to make nitrates, which are then used to make proteins and amino acids. So that's quite complicated, and you need to look at that carefully in the notes then. That's question 15, part C, which is quite difficult, asking about these root nodules containing the nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is an example of a mutualistic relationship. You've come across this in another topic, mutualistic relationship, where you have two organisms living in close proximity to each other. In this case, the plant, the legume plant, for example, the clover, and the bacteria in its roots, both are contributing something. The clover plant provides some glucose, which goes down to the roots and is available to the bacteria, which the bacteria can take nitrogen gas from the soil and turn it into ammonia and then into nitrates, and that's available to these plants. These nitrogen fixing plants, such as peas, beans, and clover, then can be planted in soils where there's very low levels of nitrates, and they don't need nitrates present in the soil. They can grow in very poor soils because they can effectively make their own ammonia and their own nitrates, and therefore make their own proteins. So that's nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now, no amount of me talking to you about this, that these nitrogen fixing bacteria would really benefit you near as much as actually doing a question. And there is several questions on this. Let me just see if I can focus in on them. So to say, questions 15 and question 16 are of particular interest there. Question 15 is a particularly difficult question, and it's asking about, it asks about the processes. It asks, state the name of the kingdom that this is going back to AS, this is a question from AS. It's asking about the bacteria in the soil. They remember the kingdom Prokaryota, if you remember correctly. And they're asking, how would you, what soil condition that would promote nitrification and decomposition and active uptake? And the answer is aerobic soil with plenty of air. It's asking, how would a farmer encourage those conditions? And you would say ploughing and drainage. And then it's asking about nitrogen fixation there, 2 marks. Nitrogen gas converted initially into ammonia, and then the ammonia is used to produce nitrates, which are then used to make organic compounds. And there's no amount of me talking to you about this would compare with you actually doing the questions there. Just to finish, there's a good question there asking about how does the number of nodules that are present in the roots, how is that related to the amount of nitrate that's already present in the soil? And what we observe is that if the soil contains a lot of nitrates already, the plant doesn't have many nodules. In other words, it doesn't need many nitrogen fixing bacteria to get its nitrates. Whereas if the soil is very lacking in nitrate, you're going to find that there's lots more nodules on the roots. It's as if the nodules are making up or compensating for the lack of nitrates present in the soil. Okay, I'm coming to a finish there. As I say, you really need to be doing questions here to get used to the types of questions that you get. Okay, all the best then.